The wind tore through Ironwood Valley, carrying ice that cut like shattered glass. Eleanor knelt in the frozen mud, her bare fingers gripping a rusted iron nail. Blood seeped from her cracked knuckles, freezing before it could drip. She slammed the flat of a heavy riverstone against the nailhead. The rotten wood of the barn door groaned, splitting under the force, but the iron bit deep. Another gust hit the valley, ripping a shingle from the roof. It clattered away into the blinding white. She reached into her apron pocket. 2 nails left. Her breath plumed in jagged, ragged bursts. The cold had stopped being an ache and turned into a dull, heavy burn creeping up her forearms. She positioned the next nail. The stone came down. A massive shadow separated itself from the blizzard. Eleanor dropped the stone. Her raw hands scrambled through the dirt, fingers closing around the cold, scarred stock of her Winchester rifle. She hauled it to her shoulder, the barrel shaking violently against the gray light. He did not walk so much as carve his way through the storm. He was a mountain of a man, wrapped in a tattered canvas duster, stiff with ice. Frost caked his thick beard, turning it into a solid block of white. Over one shoulder, he carried a battered leather satchel. In his other hand, a long-handled iron sledgehammer dragged through the snow, carving a deep trench behind him. He stopped 10 feet from the barn.
I'm telling you for the last time, get back! I won't miss!
Eleanor's voice cracked. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The metal bit into her blistered skin. The man looked at her. His eyes were entirely shadowed under the brim of a ruined felt hat, but she could feel the weight of them. He did not raise his hands. He did not speak. The wind howled, drowning out the rattling of the barn's frame. He stepped forward. Eleanor gasped, her shoulder bracing for the recoil. But before she could pull the trigger, a massive leather-clad hand closed over the rifle barrel. The sheer force of his grip pinned the weapon in place. The metal groaned. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed the barrel aside. He didn't snatch it. He didn't strike her. He simply moved the threat out of his path with the unstoppable momentum of a landslide. He walked past her boots, sinking deep into the frozen mud, and stepped into the dim interior of the barn. The heavy sledgehammer fell from his grip. It hit the dirt floor with a dull, final thud that vibrated through Eleanor's boots. He unslung the leather bag, dropping it beside the hammer, and turned his back to her, surveying the rotting structural beams of the roof. A sudden violent draft of wind caught the heavy barn door. It swung violently on its rusted hinges and slammed shut, plunging the space into sudden twilight. The latch clicked into place. The temperature inside was already dropping. Eleanor stood by the door, the rifle still halfway raised, her chest heaving. The storm raged outside, battering the thin wooden walls, but the silence inside was heavier. She was locked in a wooden cage with a freezing storm outside and a giant who had just claimed her last refuge. The rattle of iron-rimmed wheels cut through the howling wind. Before the snow could completely choke the valley pass, a black carriage drawn by 2 lathered bays pulled to a violent halt just outside the barn. Brass lanterns swung, casting sickly yellow light against the driving snow. The carriage door kicked open. Mayor Sterling stepped down the heavy collar of his wolfskin coat pulled high against his neck. Behind him, the deputy stepped into the slush, his hand resting casually on the walnut grip of his Colt. Eleanor stood in the doorway, the wind whipping her hair across her face. The cold bit into her lungs with every breath. Sterling did not cross the threshold. He stood in the mud, his polished boots sinking an inch into the freezing muck. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of heavy parchment. The red wax seal of the county bank looked like a fresh bloodstain in the gray light. He flicked his wrist. The paper hit the dirt at Eleanor's boots. The grace period ended at noon, widow, Sterling said.
I told
His voice
you I'd
was
be
smooth,
back.
carrying easily over
Neither
the storm.
snow nor hell
I told
itself
you I'd
can
have
keep
this
me
land.
from what's mine.
It's a hard night to freeze, but that roof won't hold till morning. Eleanor did not look down at the paper. Her grip tightened on the rifle barrel until her knuckles turned the color of old bone. Sterling smiled, a thin, satisfied line across his face. Then his eyes adjusted to the gloom inside the barn. The smile vanished. Gideon stood near the center stall. He had not removed his frozen duster. The sheer mass of the man seemed to suck the air out of the room. The deputy drew his revolver halfway from the leather. Sterling held up a gloved hand, his eyes narrowing at the giant. "What kind of stray dog did you let in
You
here,
ain't
Eleanor?"
nothing but trouble,
Sterling
Eleanor.
spat, stepping
When
half
I'm
a
done
pace
with
closer
you,
to the
you'll
door,
regret the
suddenly
day you
hyper-aware
crossed
of
me.
his own safety. He
And
looked
they call
Gideon
him
up and
alone.
down the ruined hat, the filthy canvas, the
dresses like a
sledgehammer
common
resting
tramp.
in the dirt. "Listen to me, you piece of wandering
This
trash.
property right here belongs
This
to the
property
county.
belongs to the county
Your
now.
time here
If you ain't
is
frozen
done.
stiff by sunrise, I'll have my men drag you out
I'm
and
gonna
string
you
you
up
up
from the
at the
ironwood
property line.
tree.
Trespassing on county land carries a heavy toll. The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor held her breath. She waited for the giant to turn to pull the massive hammer from the dirt
Cave his
to
chest in.
cave Sterling's chest
Kill
in.
him.
She wanted him to do it. The urge burned in the back of her throat. Gideon did not look
you know
at the
you're
man.
in there.
He did
It's
not look
freezing
at the
out here.
deputy.
Just give up.
He didn't even shift his weight toward the door. Slowly, he raised one massive leather-clad hand. He pressed his palm flat against the central pine beam holding the roof aloft. He slid his thumb over a deep splintering crack running down the length of the wood. A fine spray of sawdust drifted down onto his sleeve. He kept his back entirely turned to the men outside. Sterling scoffed, his initial fear
that all
turning into a
you've got?
sneer of utter contempt. "A mute and a coward. Fitting company
You seem
for you,
intent
widow.
on digging yourself
Dig a deep
mighty
hole,
deep
assuming you
hole.
find a shovel."
Hope you
He
enjoy the
turned, climbed
company,
back into the
'cause you're
carriage,
staying
and
down
slammed the
there.
door. The driver whipped the horses. The carriage disappeared into the whiteout, leaving only deep tracks that the snow immediately began to bury. Eleanor stood shivering, the foreclosure paper freezing to the mud. She looked back into the dim barn. The giant was still tracing the crack in the wood, ignoring the death sentence that had just been handed to him, calculating the exact moment the roof would cave in. The dark inside the barn turned absolute as the blizzard buried the windows. The cold was a physical weight, but the wind was worse. It battered the walls with the force of
Get
a
down,
panicked
quickly!
stampede. Then came the sound. A sharp, violent
What was
crack
that?
like a cannon
Are they
shot.
here?
The central pine beam snapped. The roof dropped a full foot. Snow poured through the splintered gap. The whole structure groaned, ready to cave and crush them both under tons of ice and timber. Eleanor braced for the end. Gideon moved. He didn't rush with blind panic. He kicked open his battered leather satchel. Coils of thick ship-grade hemp and a heavy iron block and tackle hit the dirt. In seconds, he hurled a weighted rope over a cross-braced rafter that still held solid. He rigged the pulley system, his hands moving with a calculated mechanical precision that made zero sense for a wandering drifter. He looped the heavy forged hook under the sagging main beam. Then he grabbed the tail end of the rope. He didn't yell. He just threw the slack at Eleanor's boots. She understood instantly. She dropped her rifle, grabbed the coarse hemp, and wrapped it twice around her forearms. The raw blisters on her hands screamed. Gideon wedged his massive shoulders directly under the cracked beam. He planted his boots, let out a low, guttural breath, and drove his body upward. Wood shrieked against wood. "Pull!" His voice grated out the first word he had spoken all night. It sounded like grinding stones. Eleanor threw her entire weight backward. The rope bit deep into her flesh, tearing the skin open. Warm blood soaked into the frozen fibers. She didn't let up. She dug her heels into the dirt and leaned back until her vision blurred. Through the pulley, her weight multiplied. Together, fighting gravity and the storm, they forced the broken roof back toward the sky. Holding the massive beam steady with his back, Gideon swung his sledgehammer one-handed. He kicked a thick oak support post into place and drove an iron wedge directly under the fracture, striking with devastating accuracy in the near pitch. Once, twice, bit deep. The post took the load. Gideon stepped out from under the weight. The roof settled. Eleanor dropped to her knees, the rope slipping from her ruined hands. Her chest heaved. Gideon stood by the driven post, sweat freezing in his beard. He looked at the blood on the rope, then looked down at hers. There was no pity in his eyes. There was no gentle comfort. There was only a silent, hard recognition, a respect earned in dirt and blood. They sat in the freezing dark, listening to the storm beat helplessly against their work. Hours bled away. Eventually, the pale light of dawn crept through the wall slats. The howling wind finally died, leaving a sudden heavy stillness over the valley. Eleanor slowly picked up her rifle, her fingers stiff. They had survived the night. Then the silence broke, not by the wind, but by the rhythmic, heavy crunch of a dozen horses steadily advancing through the deep snow. Sterling had returned, and this time he brought a posse. The morning sun broke over the eastern ridge, casting a blinding, painful glare across the fresh drifts. 10 riders formed a tight half-circle around the barn door. Their horses stamped at the frozen mud, blowing thick streams of steam into the still air. Sterling sat atop a heavy roan gelding. His jaw clamped shut and the barn door groaned open. He had come to collect frozen corpses. Instead, Eleanor stood in the threshold, her Winchester gripped in her raw hands. Behind her, the giant loomed in the shadows, quiet as a tomb. Sterling's eyes flicked to the reinforced support beam. Then a slow, ugly smile stretched across his face. He spurred his horse a few paces closer. "Well, ain't this a miracle?" Sterling called out, his voice sharp
We
against
start
the
digging
cold.
here, boys.
He pointed his
I
riding
want this
crop
claim
toward the
cleared
lower
by
valley.
sundown.
"But you survived on the wrong side of the dirt, widow." Eleanor's eyes tracked his whip. The flash flood from the night's storm melt had ripped through the gully, completely washing out the dry creek bed. The violent water had carved a new jagged trench 50 yards closer to the house. The county
As the
deed
county
says the
deed
property
clearly
line follows
stipulates,
the wash.
the property line
Sterling
follows
said,
the
leaning
newly
over his
washed
saddle
out
horn.
creek bed.
The wash moved. That means this
The dirt
barn and
under
the
it
dirt
now
under it
sits
sits square
squarely
on
on
my
my
jurisdiction,
land.
which makes you and your large friend there armed trespassers. Sterling didn't wait for an argument. He raised 2 fingers. Around him, 10 men lifted their weapons. The synchronized heavy metallic clicks of lever actions and revolver hammers being cocked cut through the morning silence. A dozen barrels pointed directly at the doorway. "Drop the rifle, Eleanor," Sterling ordered the false politeness going, "or my deputies will clear this land by force." The cold clamped down on Eleanor's chest. The law didn't matter here. The surveyor lines didn't matter.
Do not matter
This was
here.
an execution dressed up with a badge. She looked at the giant. He had spent the entire night holding up the roof, bleeding and freezing, just to keep a stranger alive. He owed her nothing. She owed him the air in her lungs. Eleanor stepped forward. She didn't drop the gun. She stepped fully in front of the giant, shielding his massive frame of her own. She hauled the Winchester to her shoulder. Her torn fingers locked around the trigger guard. Blood smeared against the cold steel. "The first man who levels a sight gets a hole in his throat," she said. Her voice did not shake. She braced her boots in the snow. She was ready to die in the mud as long as she took Sterling with her. The deputies hesitated, glancing at the mayor. Sterling's face darkened, furious at the defiance. "Shoot them both," he snarled. Before a single trigger could break, a massive shadow shifted behind Eleanor. A heavy leather-clad hand reached over her shoulder. The movement was incredibly slow, completely devoid of panic. Calloused fingers wrapped around the steel barrel of her Winchester. Gently, but with a physical force she could not fight, Gideon pressed the weapon down. Eleanor gasped, her breath catching as she twisted to look at him. His face remained unreadable under the ruined hat. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't pick up his sledgehammer. Leaving Eleanor behind, the giant walked out of the barn entirely empty-handed and stepped directly into the crosshairs of 10 loaded guns. The crunch of Gideon's boots in the fresh snow sounded like snapping bones. He walked past Eleanor, stepping entirely out from the shadow of the barn, and stopped 10 paces from Sterling's roan gelding. 12 gun barrels tracked his chest. A single flinch from any rider would tear him apart. Gideon did not raise his hands. The heavy animal slump of his shoulders vanished. He straightened his spine, locking into place. The massive, ragged drifter suddenly carried himself with the rigid, terrifying posture of a commander taking a battlefield.
There will be order in
When he
this
spoke, the
territory.
gravel in his throat was gone.
My decision
His
on the
voice
matter
cut through the
is
freezing
final.
air, sharp, precise, and echoing
Township
with
4,
absolute authority.
Range 7 West,
Township
legal
4,
coordinates.
Range 7 West, Section 12. Sterling's horse
Sterling,
pinned its ears back,
We're waiting
unsettled
for
by
you.
the booming
Come
tone.
out now.
The mayor frowned, his grip tightening on his riding crop. What gibberish
What
are you
in
spitting,
blazes
you
is that
filthy stray?
gibberish you're spouting?
Gideon did not
Speak
blink.
plain or I'll cut
His
your
eyes
tongue
stayed
out.
locked on Sterling, cold
The
and
charter is
entirely
absolute,
unbothered by
gentlemen.
the guns.
These
The
freezing
county charter
grounds
you
are
hold
settled land,
relies on the
and we will not be
1864
moved by
territorial
force.
survey.
I told
Gideon
you
said
once,
his words clipping
do
off
not
like
return.
hammer strikes.
This land is
That
mine.
survey cited the creek bed
next
as a
time you
temporary
won't walk
visible
away.
boundary
This
predicated
geographical
on a
boundary
fixed
is predicated on a fixed
magnetic
magnetic
declination
declination
of
of exactly
13
13
east.
degrees east. The survey
A
lines
heavy
must account
silence
for this
fell over the
variance.
posse. The deputies lowered their rifles a fraction of an inch, glancing at one another. The tension of an execution had suddenly been
I
derailed
can't make heads
by a
nor
language
tails of
they
this,
did
Bill.
not
Is
understand.
this even
A
English?
flash flood shifts,
It just goes
silt,
on and
rock.
on about the aforementioned
Gideon
party.
continued. He took
A
one
flash
slow
flood
pace
alters
forward.
topography,
It
but does
alters
not alter
topography.
federal lines.
It does not alter cartography.
The
The
Federal,
Federal
Meridian line
runs dead north through
straight
the
through that
ironwood tree
in the
on the ridge
distance.
triangulated from the limestone bluff 2
The
miles
boundary
east.
sits exactly 40
By
rods
those
east
exact
of the old oak,
coordinates,
running
the
due
legal
north.
boundary sits
That is
84
where the
feet
legal
past
certainty
the
ends,
rear wall
Sterling.
of this barn. Sterling's face lost its color. The arrogant, ugly sneer collapsed into slack-jawed shock. He opened his mouth, but only a thin breath of white steam came out. Cold sweat broke out along his hairline. Gideon
You are a
raised
disgrace
thick,
to this
scarred
town,
finger
Mayor. I aim
and
to see
pointed
you
it
hang for
directly
this.
at the mayor's
You have
face.
no proof, Gideon.
You forged
Watch
a
your
local
mouth.
deed based on
You
shifting
used the
water,
shifting
Sterling.
water trick. You
You bet
gambled
a
a widow's life that the
no
true
one in this
boundaries
valley
would stay
possessed
hidden.
the mathematics
You can't
to
prove
prove you
that,
a thief.
Gideon.
You calculated wrong. A deputy near the back of the pack slowly uncocked his revolver. The metallic click was deafening in the quiet night. Another followed, then a third. They were hired guns for a legal eviction, not accomplices to federal land fraud. Sterling swallowed hard. His eyes darted frantically over the giant in the ruined canvas coat. The man standing in the mud was filthy bleeding and half frozen. Yet he wielded the complex intellectual law of the government like a loaded weapon. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her rifle suddenly feeling entirely useless. She stared at the broad back of the stranger. He was no wandering cowhand. The coordinates, the geometry, the absolute crushing command of the situation, it defied everything he appeared to be. Gideon did not break eye contact with the mayor. Slowly, deliberately, he reached a massive hand into the deep pocket of his frozen duster. Gideon pulled his hand from the deep pocket of his duster. His thick fingers were wrapped around a heavy, rust-pitted cylinder of solid iron. He tossed it into the snow at Sterling's horse's hooves. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. Sterling looked down. Stamped into the flat top of the iron was the heavy, unmistakable seal of the United States Department of the Interior. The original geological marker, Gideon said, his voice flat. Driven into the bedrock 50
I know
feet below
because I
that
said
barn
it.
in 1864. I know because I drove it there. Sterling's horse sidestepped, sensing the sudden sharp spike of fear rolling off its rider. I dug it up last night while setting a brace under the widow's floorboards. Gideon
That
continued.
marker belongs under the
He
widow's
stepped closer.
floorboards.
The deputies parted for him. My name is Gideon Vance, former Chief Assessor, Federal Land Office. I left Washington because I grew sick of looking at
They say
corrupt,
you can't
thieving
avoid death or
politicians.
taxes.
Seems I can't
But they
ride far
forgot
enough
to
to
mention
escape the
grasping
stench.
politicians
Gideon
like
picked up
you,
the
Mayor.
iron marker, wiping the snow from the seal. A federal wire goes to the marshal in Denver as soon as the pass thaws. He's been looking for the man altering the county plats. Now he has the physical proof and my sworn testimony. Sterling's jaw worked, but no sound came out. The color drained from his face, leaving him the shade of dirty milk. He looked at the faces of his
Ride.
deputies. Not one of them met his eye. Ride, Gideon commanded. It wasn't a threat. It was a dismissal.
Get us
Sterling yanked the reins hard, turning the roan around. He spurred the horse violently and kicked up a spray of wet snow, fleeing toward the valley road. His men followed, leaving a trail of churned mud and silence. The tension snapped. The wind died down to a low hum. Gideon stood in the snow for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back into the barn. He bent down, picked up his heavy iron sledgehammer, and hoisted his battered canvas bag over his shoulder. He didn't look at Eleanor. He just pulled the brim of his ruined hat down low and started walking toward the road. Eleanor did not move out of the way. She stepped squarely into the center of the doorway, her boots planted firmly on the wooden threshold. She lowered the barrel of the Winchester, resting the stock in the dirt, but she didn't shift her weight. Gideon stopped. He looked down at her. His massive chest rose and fell. The weather broke.
You will
he
hold the
rasped.
land now.
You'll hold the land now. Eleanor looked at his raw, bleeding hands. She looked at the heavy oak beam holding her roof up. Then she looked him dead in the eye. That roof needs new shingles before the spring thaw.
Don't look for mercy where there is none.
Voice hard, entirely
You made your
devoid
bed
of
in the
pity
snow,
or
now lie in
softness.
it. This
And I
is the
don't
last
pay
you'll
for
see of
labor
me.
with thank yous. Silence stretched between them. The cold air rushed through the open barn doors. Slowly, the tension drained from Gideon's shoulders. The heavy sledgehammer slipped from his grip, hitting the dirt floor with a familiar thud. The canvas bag followed. For the first time since he walked out of the blizzard, the wild frozen lines of the giant's face broke. The corner of his mouth twitched, cracking the dried blood on his lip. Gideon smiled.